Welcome to this Oxford Analytica video briefing. My name's William Attwell and I'm here with my colleague and fellow Africa analyst Hannah Waddilove, and today we're going to be talking about Africa's emerging middle classes. Hannah, there's been a lot of many reports that have come out in recent months regarding Africa's emerging middle classes from institutions like the Africa Development Bank and most recently Standard Bank in South Africa. These reports paint a very rosy picture about Africa's consuming classes and their rising incomes. But what do we really mean when we talk about Africa's middle class, and how useful is it as a label?
So to begin, I think it's probably not very useful as a label, given the data that we have and the data that goes behind these glossy reports that you mentioned. So essentially what we're talking about when we think about Africa's emerging middle class in broad terms is the rise of consumption patterns, purchasing power, primarily in Africa's cities, and even then not in all African cities, but many of them. The context to this is obviously broader economic growth in many of these countries since around 2000 on the back of the global commodities boom, and this has really, on the African middle class question, is still more of an informalised type phenomenon. So we are not necessarily talking about the development of large private sectors in any of these countries, but we are talking about greater urbanisation patterns, people moving from rural areas into cities, and economic growth providing, as the definition states, greater opportunities for income generation. So by virtue of the fact that there's more economic activity going on in these economies, and much of that is situated in urban areas. The critical point here, I think, is what we're talking about in terms of scale. So the data that is in many of these reports, when you dig down deep into it, and Standard Bank report actually put this a little bit higher up on the page, as it were, is that much of the growth is in the low income brackets, about as low as you can get. So Africa Development Bank's report in 2011 was talking about those who were consuming between $2 and $4 a day, and then also between those who were consuming between $4 and $10 a day. Standard Bank were less specific about the actual amount, but did say that out of the 11 economies that they surveyed, so it was about half of sub-Saharan Africa's total population, 75 million of those 500 million would have been deemed middle class, but 86% of those 75 million were in the low vulnerable income bracket. So when we're talking about emerging middle class, we're really still talking about a lower end of kind of poor people who've been sort of moved up into this subgroup of less poor but still quite vulnerable households who are consuming more.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean the figures on consumption to date do indicate this uptick, which is obviously compelling to international donors and investors and national country governments as well. But they also tend to report a continued upswing in consumption moving into the future. You have reports coming out of private sector think tanks like the McKinsey Global Institute, for instance, projecting really massive increases in consumption in countries like Nigeria, moving forward to say 2030. How sustainable are these increases, and what are they based on?
Well, I think, as your question has hinted, that we have to be very careful about these huge projections that go into decades into the future. They are based primarily on looking at very favourable population growth figures, along with favourable demographic shifts in terms of younger populations, both of which are true to some extent and are seen in many countries across the region, combined with high GDP growth rates, and seeing the kind of happy marriage of those two factors, or those three factors, as a reason to think that these are going to be rising consumer classes. We have to be careful with these projections into the future, not least because GDP growth is not a certainty for the next 2-3 decades. Much of it is still reliant on high demand externally, so rather than providing momentum internally, we've still got a high external demand for many of these growth outlooks. And the other side of it as well is thinking about this data is really underpinned and predicated on lessons learned from urbanisation patterns in other parts of the developing world. That is that greater urbanisation often leads to higher income, and that, not to get too technical here, but the type of structure of those sort of economic growth patterns that we saw elsewhere in the world really concerned the move from agriculture, low productivity sectors into urban areas and higher productivity manufacturing type sectors. In sub-Saharan Africa, in the majority of places, if not all cities, that's really not what we're seeing. We are seeing people move to the cities, but we're not seeing them to move to higher productivity manufacturing sectors, rather informal services sectors that are highly variegated across scale in terms of the actual income generation possibility out of them. And so we're seeing greater demographic and population shifts, but not really a fundamental change in the structure of these economies, which does raise some questions about how sustainable this is over the longer term.
I'd like to pick up on the point you made about the manufacturing sector, because of course the flip side to increased consumption, even if it's not as ambitious and not as optimistic as these reports tend to suggest, is that this provides presumably an opportunity for African-based manufacturers to supply those products that these new consumers will purchase. But of course there are structural problems facing the manufacturing sector, and those won't go away easily.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, Africa's manufacturing sector very broadly has actually declined in the last few decades. And the question of whether it will continue its decline is an open one at this point. We've certainly, on the basis of very high imports in many of these countries to fuel this consumer demand that is rising, is often on the basis of Chinese imports into Africa, for example, which has been a very difficult political problem when they kind of completely flood local markets and even potentially undermine the potential for African manufacturing. In terms of basing a kind of a manufacturing outlet to service the local demand, local markets, there are, as you hint, huge structural problems to that, not least infrastructure deficits, power shortages, which, while the productivity levels of your workforce are not necessarily any higher or lower than elsewhere, you're really adding a huge amount of cost onto your kind of factory floor productivity level due to these broader structural deficits. So the future is uncertain on that one, and I think it's something that we'll continue looking at.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for joining us for this video briefing. We look forward to seeing you next time.